What happens with these regime change wars is never in the U.S. interests. Libya fell into complete anarchy. Syria, still anarchy. Iraq, ISIS, which honestly bled into Syria. And now Yemen, still the Houthis and the Houthis. And so when it comes to Iran, what's going to happen there? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Gap Fillers podcast. My name is Michael Bradford. The big news in today's in the world for the past couple weeks has been the Iranian conflict between Israel and the United States. The United States, seemingly out of nowhere, launched attacks against the Iranian strategic forces and has taken out now on the third supreme leader. The big reason Trump gave for these primarily is regime change, which is sort of like freeing the people kind of reasoning. The nuclear weapons consistently for the past 30 years have been an argument given forth, and basically U.S. strategic interest, primarily the Strait of Hormuz and oil coming through there. Now, I find these arguments to be fairly weak. The U.S., I frankly believe a majority of you are tired of the U.S. consistently being involved in foreign conflicts. Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, now Iran. If you go down the list, the U.S. has been in more regime change wars in the past 20 years, as opposed probably for the majority of the Cold War. I mean, I can name a couple: Nicaragua, Angola, Nigeria, I think. So maybe it's very comparable, but one would think that after the Cold War, regime change wars would be a thing of the past or very much lessened. And honestly, it hasn't lessened. In fact, one could say it's picked up the pace, the frequency. Now that there's a less of a big kid on the block like the Soviet Union. Now, what happens with these regime change wars is never in the U.S. interests. Libya fell into complete anarchy. Syria, still anarchy. Iraq, ISIS, which honestly bled into Syria. And now Yemen, still the Houthis and the Houthis. And so when it comes to Iran, what's going to happen there? The largest population, we've kind of almost worked our way up. Iraq was keeping Iran in place. Both of them hated each other, even though they were both Muslim strong men. They're opposite sides, Shia and Shiite. So and honestly, Saddam Hussein was very much keeping Iran in check. And so you had almost a strategic balance of power in the region that has now been completely annihilated since the 90s, specifically, and then finished off in the 2000s. Now, ironically, they haven't changed their tune. The WMD lie that happened in Iraq is sort of the same thing that's happening in Iran. However, Iran does admit to trying to develop a nuclear weapon. Do I want them to have a nuclear weapon? No. Will they have a nuclear weapon? No. However, the continuing of regime change, specifically by the U.S. in the region, has basically made everyone in the region dependent on the U.S., a protectorate, right? So you go down the line: Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia. They're all kind of dependent on U.S. naval forces and U.S. military forces to basically keep peace, keep the balance, so to speak. We are the new Iraq, so to speak. Now, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that was the strategic mistake of Saddam. However, overall, now the U.S. is stuck trying to balance out the region. Once Iran falls, guarantee you they'll find somebody else. I mean, Trump's already shifting towards Cuba, and now those are all the weak arguments that Trump has given for the threats. The imminent threat, obviously not true, or he lied when he said the Iranian nuclear program was completely destroyed last year. So so prevent Iran from acquiring and rebuilding nuclear weapons. Same thing. You go down the line. Proxy terror groups is probably the biggest reason. However, the U.S. has consistently made the problem worse. There's a verse in the Bible: "The sins of the father shall be visited upon the son," and this is pretty much what has happened. 40 years, 80 years of mistakes in the Middle East have come back to roost and become today's problem. So, they're supporting them in Lebanon or in Gaza or Yemen, and that was a problem that was created by our grandparents, or the boomer generation, the silent generation, and so the regime change one is probably the weakest because it's the most tiring argument of them all. The nuclear weapons, Iran has been 2 weeks away from acquiring, or 2 months or 2 years away from acquiring a nuclear weapon for 30 years. So longer than I've been alive, they've been close to developing nuclear weapons, and we've always been dragged into that. Now, the regime change one is as old as empire themselves. Sargon II, Sargon I, all the way through Napoleon, through the Umayyad Empire. Take your pick. All the major empires of the last 200 years, especially. So Russia, America, the British, the French. All of them have used this excuse. We're freeing the people from oppression. We are going to topple this dictator, this oppressor, and the people will be free under us. Always replace another dictator with a dictator. So it never ends the way that the people who wanted the regime change. It's always it's probably the weakest argument ever. Alexander the Great gave that. It was just all over. It's all over history, and it's always the weakest. It's always when you can't find a place, a reason to go to war that would be legitimate. You always have to use the freeing certain people from the oppression of certain people. If that was true, we would have gone to war against Turkey a long time ago for the Kurds or for the Armenians. It's the weakest argument of them all. Because there's oppressed people all over the world, and the U.S. doesn't care about those people, but when it's a strategic enemy, Iran, suddenly we care. The U.S. is very unique in the world, and the West has become very unique in the world now, that the U.S. has, for the most part, not been overly aggressive in oppressing minorities. Especially in the last 60 to 80 years. We have shifted very much away from that. Now, you might say, well, during segregation, and that was a problem in the South, and all across the U.S. that was a problem. Oh, no doubt. But the amount of oppression compared to the mass genocide of the Kurds or the mass genocides of the Twa people, it really bears no comparison. And so the U.S. is very diverse and very uniquely diverse because it does not oppress overtly the minority populations in the world, in the U.S. And ironically, it becomes the biggest hang up on a lot of elections is because of that. So regime change, terrible excuse. Nuclear program, tiring, old excuse that is always trying to be brought up pretty much every year. And then the U.S. should not really be trying to fight other people's wars. Okay, so if Iraq or say Yemen, right? Why didn't we invade Yemen? Why haven't we? Well, I mean, we've struck Yemen, but if the Houthis were such a terrorizing force against the U.S. specifically, none of U.S. trade, let me rephrase that, very, very, very little U.S. trade goes through the Red Sea and through the Gulf of Aden, where these attacks for the Houthis have been. Why doesn't Europe? Why doesn't Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia? Why don't they take care of their region? Well, partially it's because of the U.S. The U.S. doesn't want arms proliferation. We want to be the top dog all around the world. The problem is that instantly puts us in $30 trillion in debt. Well, not instantly. 30 years, $30 trillion in debt. So it makes us have to sustain strategic interest all time. We have to be fully mobilized as a U.S. economy, as the U.S. military, the whole time. And it's never sustainable. The Roman Empire couldn't sustain it. The British Empire couldn't sustain it. The French Empire couldn't sustain it. The German Empire couldn't sustain it. Nobody can sustain a mobilized economy towards military for an overtly extended period of time. It just isn't economically feasible. This is why that there's always a strategic force kept to hold other people at bay, but you strategically have reserves and people outside of the military. So the U.S. consistently spends 3% of GDP, whereas most of Europe spends 1.5%, below 2%, overwhelmingly below 2% of GDP. And so the U.S. So all of Europe depends on the U.S. All of the Middle East depends on the U.S. All of Central America pretty much depends on the U.S. No other country, if you're a strategic ally, you can depend on the U.S. to spend 3 to 4% of GDP at all times in order to prevent China, in order to prevent some, other, nation, Eritrea versus Ethiopia kind of deal, So we've constantly had to keep up our military force to prevent other people from building up their military force. The problem is that eventually you're going to run into a financial collapse, and the U.S. won't be able to sustain that, or you develop so weak of allies that strategically you're just so spread thin that no matter how great your military or economic power is, you can't fight China, India, or Pakistan, depending on which time period you're in, or Russia, all at the same time. You're just not going to be able to do it. So what we've tried to do right now, I think, is we're nitpicking one by one. But eventually, the U.S. is going to fall, or we're going to have complete global hegemony. Now, should the U.S. have complete global hegemony? Rule, basically dictate the whims of the world. Yes, in a way, but not in this fashion. The U.S. should dominate by pure force and purely economic force, or allow other people to solve their problems. I don't want global hegemony as the U.S. Forcing itself on everybody throughout the world. I want the U.S. to be able to rule through economic forces. Ironically, we've given that away, and we've given that up, really, in lieu of military power. We've given all of our economy to foreign countries, pretty much. Our manufacturing all comes from other places. In fact, we're running into that problem now. 2 weeks into the Iranian strikes, is that the U.S. is low on missiles. So this regime change never ends. Okay, you're going to have Cuba. You had Venezuela. You had I understand the strategic value of going after these. The problem is that it never ends, and it never ends up how you want it. Venezuela probably is a very rare, and it's still not how you want it. But name a country that we've done regime change in the last 80 years, and I don't think I can name one that's turned out very, very well. Nicaragua turned out like garbage. Any African country turned out to be garbage. Middle East, pretty much just garbage. I mean, you're just never going to have the person in place that you want unless you're willing to do stuff that the U.S. morally won't do. And ironically, eventually China is going to be the Thespian trap, or the Thespian? No, Thucydides trap. Thespian's different. Thucydides trap that the U.S. Can't overcome. And that's because they have a billion people, and sooner or later, if it's not China, it will be India. It will be another top dog that we have to outcompete. And the more export of our economy that we give away, the more it becomes a strategic problem, because if most of our goods come from China or through the strait there near Singapore and Thailand and Indonesia, then you end up with a crippled economy, and and unless you bring that back, which Trump has tried to do at least. Now, the reason China and Russia may not get involved is primarily because Russia is tied down in Ukraine, which has basically bled both of their economies and manpower dry, Ukraine and Russia, that is. And in doing so, it's almost knocked Russia out of the fight, so to speak. And so the only person would be China. China wants Taiwan, so it needs a weakened United States or a busy United States in order not to do that. Well, you're coming up on the it's the population collapse problem that China has because of the one-child policy. They have to have, they'll never have more people than they have currently. And that's if they're not lying about their numbers already. So why should we, so China wants a busy U.S. so they can take Taiwan. At least that's their strategic goal. However, now that you have a strengthening Japan, you probably need China, and China probably needs to act, if they're going to act, very soon. Because they'll never have more men of fighting age, because their economy or their population will end up shrinking. Excuse me. India has become, and they're a very, let's just say they're their economic rival in the region. So the people that were exporting jobs to China are now exporting jobs to India, or manufacturing in India. And so that might be a strategic, the next strategic problem for China to get involved. And so China has a very small window, but they're not likely to move. They're more concerned with economics as of right now, still to this day, because they're still economically reliant on the U.S. just as much as the U.S. is on China. So the next regime change will be Cuba, and eventually you're going to end up with Russia and China being the ones that need the regime change. And so I think the U.S. might try to step up their calls for regime change in the region of possibly Vietnam or some Southeast country to get it closer to China and to make it to more economically isolate them, so to speak. But anyways, all that to say is Iran, I strongly oppose the Iran strikes. The most balanced person I've seen on this, if I can recommend somebody, would be Joe Walsh. Ironically, from the Daily Wire, he's been I think one of the best people that to have a balanced view on this. Primarily because he works for Ben Shapiro. It's very shocking that he is taking a non-interventionist role, at least commentary in this. But I'll probably do another video on this next week, depending on how it goes. I want to focus more on Florida and our problems that we have here. But all in all, don't agree with it. Weak excuses to go to war. And honestly, I think it honestly might have. I'll wrap up after this. It might have to do with the Epstein files and the horror show that was the Pam Bondi hearings with 50,000. That was over 50,000, and so that polled absolutely horrible. And Trump's approval numbers have been tanking since then, and so one of the most dangerous thing, there's a saying like this, the most dangerous thing in the world is a president with low approval numbers, because war tends to bring out high approval numbers, and it easily distracts from the other problems. So I want to cover Epstein. That'll be later. That'll be probably next week or the week after, depending on the news. But thank you for joining me for this episode of the Gap Fillers podcast. If you like what you heard so far, I know I rambled a little bit, but go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at GapFillers1776. Like, comment, subscribe. All of those help the podcast. It shoots us up in the algorithm, so to speak. But I hope you all enjoy your week, and remember, freedom demands responsibility. I'll see you in the next video.